we call this question a sufficient assumption question, and the question stem here reads the philosopher's conclusion follows logically if which one of the following assumes. So those are the key words. If we assume one of the following, then the conclusion follows logically. Now this premise, this question stem tells us that the conclusion currently does not follow logically, because if it already followed logically, how are we going to make it follow? It already follows logically, right? So obviously it does not follow logically already. We have to find a premise, find one of these answer choices, use it as a premise in conjunction with the existing premises, and then we have ourselves a logical argument, an argument that is said to be must be true, that is said to be valid when the premises are true, premises being the premises that are present in the stimulus plus the right answer choice, then the conclusion must also be true. So that's a idea that we cover in depth in our sufficient assumption and logic lessons. But I hope that's enough. Let's see if that's enough for us to figure this out anyway. So philosopher says an action is morally right if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of people affected by it. So if we can reasonably expect an increase in the well-being, then we can say, right? Then we can say the action is right, is a good action. It's right. So that's from our translation lessons and logic lessons, which I can't get into. It would take too long to get into details. But if always introduces a sufficient condition. If this thing happens, then this other thing happens. So we represent it in our language by saying, if this thing happens, then this thing happens. If we reasonably expect an increase in well-being, then this thing is said to be right. Next, we have an action is wrong if and only if. If and only if is our biconditional statement. So wrong, right? Wrong. If it would be reasonably expected to reduce the well-being. So reasonably expected to reduce the well-being. Now let's not make a sort of mistake that you'll see a lot on the LSAT, which is let's remember that these two aren't logical negations of each other, because a thing could be neutral, right? Something could be reasonably expected to remain neutral of the well-being. And right or wrong, I don't know. Let's also not. I mean, there could be things that are just morally neutral too, right? So anyway, this statement here with a biconditional, that's in one of our advanced logic lessons. Essentially what a biconditional does is it just, in logical reasoning at least, in logic games it does something very different, but for logical reasoning, what a biconditional does is it just says of these two ideas, they are exactly the same idea. You can think of a biconditional as an equal sign. So, we it just so happens that in English, we have two different sets of phrases to describe exactly the same idea, right? The idea is you can call it wrong, or you can call it reasonably expected to decrease the aggregate well-being of you. They sound different, they're different words, but they express exactly the same idea. That's what a biconditional does in English. It's just equivalence. So anyway, so from these premises, we conclude thus actions that would be reasonably expected to leave the unchanged aggregate well-being of people are also right. Okay, so then we're saying so that if you reasonably expect to leave unchanged the well-being, how do I represent unchanged? I don't know. Let's just do this. The well-being, just do nothing to the well-being. Then that's also right. Well, how can we do that? See, because as it stands, this argument doesn't make any sense. I'm going to move the conclusion down a little bit. By the way, I know this is going to be too advanced. If you've never done any logic, I apologize. I don't think there's any way I can communicate this to you without teaching you, just hours of logic ahead of time. So just try your best to follow along. Don't feel too bad if you can't. We do have a full lesson that sort of gets you to the level of this. But without this language, I'd have to appeal to then intuition, which is hard because if you're watching this video, probably your intuition didn't get you the right answer choice. So you see. Anyway, but let's see if we can do our best. So one thing you have to understand is that the LSAT does expect you to be able to make conclusions, draw conclusions from things that they consider obvious. So here, this idea right here, actually, I'll just start writing in a different color. This idea here, if you're reasonably expecting to leave unchanged the well-being, right, then that means you are not reasonably expecting to reduce the well-being. Yeah, I think this is a sort of a very self-evident relationship. If we're leaving something unchanged, then we're certainly not reducing it. Okay? So this question requires you to get this. It requires you to have like an aha moment where you realize this. All right. So next what it requires of you, you have to first realize this. And then after realizing this, you have to understand what this biconditional means. You have to realize that this biconditional means that if I fail this, I'm also failing this. If I'm not reasonably decreasing the well-being, then it's not wrong. So that's the next thing you need to understand, is this. All right, great. So now our idea here, this leave unchanged idea here, right, which is in our conclusion, we're trying to get it to the R, trying to get it to right. But so far, and that's two big steps we've already made. These are the two sort of huge hurdles you had to jump over to even get this far. This idea now takes us all the way over to not W. So then all we have to say, the only thing that remains, and this is what's going to make for the right answer choice, is for W slash to go over to R. You see, if we can presume this, if something is not wrong, then it's right, then we've successfully established that leaving it unchanged does push over to right. See, now this idea just arrows over to this idea, which then arrows over to this idea, which then arrows over to R. So now we can logically conclude that this idea arrows over to R. So you see, that's the missing premise that we need. That's the premise that if we had it, then this becomes a logically valid argument. So we're just looking for this. And this actually is how you do this type of question. I know right now it seems impossible. You're thinking there's no way you'll ever get it, but that's just not true. Sufficient assumption questions for LSAT students who study tend to be the questions that they get right the most, at least with our methodology. And it's great because initially they are very difficult. So most people won't be getting these. But then see, if you study, you will get these. It's very mechanical, right, really. All right, so we're looking for this. If something is not wrong, then it's right. And look, any action that is not wrong is right. There you go. That's what makes C the correct answer choice. The rest of them are incorrect simply because they're not this. That's it. Because they're not this. So let's take a look at B. No action is both wrong and right. Okay, so actions can only be wrong, or they can be right, or I suppose they can be neutral, I suppose, right? See, but just saying no action is both wrong and right doesn't tell me that there isn't such a thing as neutral actions. But that's exactly what C tells us. C tells us there are no neutral actions, right? They're either right or wrong. So if they're not wrong, they must be right. That's what makes this the correct answer choice. This is what allows us to draw the conclusion. B doesn't do it. A says only wrong actions will be reasonably expected to produce a blah 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 blah. All right, whatever. Right? You can say this, but just like you stick this back into an argument, it's not going to help us get to the conclusion because we know exactly what we need to get to the conclusion. D says there are actions that will be reasonably expected to leave. I'm sure there are. And so what? And see, we need this. E says only right actions have good consequences. That's great. Still not what we need though.